So can Doge really deliver on this whole idea of cutting $1 trillion? Because Elon Musk and members of his team recently sat down for an interview with Fox News and addressed various goals, findings, and even criticisms of Doge. He once again stated that Doge's goal was to cut $1 trillion from the budget, but is this really possible? And does this mean that Doge is going to have to cut from programs that have become somewhat sacred to voters like Social Security? So let's take a look, because if we are trying to find stories on things like fraud, waste, and abuse, we're going to start by going to Ground News. You'll notice right here, the Ground News has its own page specifically dedicated toward Doge. Now, the benefit here is that I can find an article I'm looking for, like Musk blames Dems for Trump giving immigrants Social Security numbers. I'm going to click on that, and it's going to go ahead and take me to all the various articles which are featured discussing this particular topic. And as you can see, I can get a brief summary of the various headlines that are covered by left, center, and right. Not to mention the fact that I can look at bias distribution, which indicates that, well, there may be a little bit of a blind spot here, because in this particular story, it almost looks like it's covered exclusively by the right. All of that information is incredibly helpful when we're trying to gather the information in order to perform these programs. Now, Ground News is a website and an app that gathers related articles in one place so you can compare headlines, helping you to understand not just what's happening, but who's telling the story and why. So, if you're like us and you are somewhat frustrated with the way that typical search engines curate the news, where you only get one perspective, go over to ground.news/Doge and check out all of the different features they provide. In fact, if you go over there right now to ground.news/Doge, you can get 40% off the Vantage plan, which will give you access to all the features you need to keep track of everything that is going on with Doge and otherwise. Let's get back to the story. So let's look at this quick clip of the interview with Elon Musk and his team and Bret Baier on Fox News.
First, let me start with you, Elon. What are the budgetary savings goals, and how much do you think you've achieved so far?
Our goal is to reduce the deficit by $1 trillion, from a nominal deficit of $2 trillion to try to cut the deficit in half to $1 trillion, or looked at it in total federal spending to drop the federal spending from $7 trillion to $6 trillion. We want to reduce the spending by eliminating waste and fraud, reduce the spending by 15%, which seems really quite achievable. The government is not efficient, and there's a lot of waste and fraud, so we feel confident that a 15% reduction can be done without affecting any of the critical government services.
Okay, so once again, right out of the horse's mouth, they want to cut $1 trillion, which is a certain percentage of spending that they're going for. So what does that look like? Well, first, we need to actually look at what the federal budget looks like. Now, as of this fiscal year alone, which started on October 1st, 2024, the federal government has spent over $3 trillion. But what have they spent it on? So it's important to understand that the federal budget is broken down into three major categories. You have mandatory spending, net interest costs on the debt, and discretionary spending. Your mandatory spending are things like Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare, as well as some other programs which are essentially automatic. This is spending that is written directly into the law and has to be spent unless Congress specifically acts in order to make changes. Now, net interest costs on the debt, this is just the interest on the debt. Now, keep in mind, paying this does not reduce the debt at all. It is merely the money that we have to pay in order to keep from defaulting on the debt. And finally, there is discretionary spending. Discretionary is determined on an annual basis as part of a negotiation between the House, the Senate, and the presidency. And this is the primary area Doge has been focusing on so far because, quite frankly, it's the easiest to cut in the budget. Now, this part is important. When we look at the federal budget and analyze how the money is currently allocated, we run into a pretty obvious problem. Because as we look at this chart from fiscal year 22, we see that most of the money the federal government takes in is already spent. Now, how much exactly are we talking about? Well, between mandatory spending and interest on the debt, roughly 74% of the entire federal budget is already eaten up. So what exactly does that leave Elon and Doge to work with when we're talking about budget cuts? Well, if you take out defense spending, there's only about 15 to 16% of the entire federal budget, which means Elon is going to have to find waste in other areas of the budget. And he explains how they found some of that in this clip right here.
We routinely encounter wastes of $1 billion or more, casually. For example, like the simple survey, literally 10-question survey that you could do with SurveyMonkey, cost you about $10,000, the government was being charged almost $1 billion for that.
For just the survey?
$1 billion for a simple online survey, do you like the national park? And then there appeared to be no feedback loop for what would be done with that survey. So the survey would just go into nothing. It was like insane.
Now, look, there's no question that finding $1 billion here and $1 billion there, and pretty soon you're talking about real money, I say sarcastically. But $1 trillion is massive. It's the equivalent of finding something like what Elon just described 1,000 more times. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to go over to the Doge savings page, and we're going to take a look at the work that has already been completed. And we find out that it's quite a bit. As you can see, a ton of savings has been found so far in departments all over the government, and $140 billion in total savings to this point is significant, especially when you consider how horribly wasteful that spending actually was. But it wasn't just waste, right? A lot of this was deliberately ideological spending that has gone on in your name, and there's even more this week that Doge has uncovered. Things like this. For instance, the Department of Labor contracts that include things like $577 million in American Last grants. What all does that include? How about $10 million for gender equity in the Mexican workforce? How about $12.2 million for worker empowerment in South America? Or how about $5 million for elevating women's participation in the workplace in West Africa, among others? Now, maybe you like this spending, maybe you don't, but it's pretty difficult to explain how this is a legitimate function of the federal government. But while a lot of the spending is just ideologically driven, others is horribly inefficient and just downright irresponsible. And here are some of the worst recent examples. For instance, the Small Business Administration has 17,580 unused ServiceNow licenses, despite having only about 8,000 employees and contractors. Now, you may be thinking, what's the big deal? So they had a lot of extra licenses. Those licenses cost $2 million annually at the Small Business Administration. Now, think about this for a second. How many small businesses in the country could afford $2 million a year in that kind of waste? What this means, when you think about it, is that small businesses all across the country were paying taxes in part to help fund a small business administration that was wasting it on software licenses that they didn't even need. Now, you think that's bad? Have you heard of the mine? Yeah, it turns out that there is a federal mine in Pennsylvania that handles all of the federal retirement records. And it's so inefficient that it means that despite the fact that the federal government employs millions of people, it's only capable of handling about 8,000 retirements a month, which is abysmal, all because of an incredibly archaic, inefficient, and quite frankly, absurd system where all retirement accounts are in folders underground in a mine. Like very little, if any, automation. It is so convoluted that federal employees have to go through very specific retirement training just to navigate what ends up becoming a months-long process for many of them. But as happy as we all are with the fact that Doge is exposing this, we know that this alone probably is not going to get us to $1 trillion in cuts. So the question is, where are you going to find the rest of it? And this is where concerns about Social Security and other programs come into play, articulated in this clip right here.
There's a lot of mystery about Social Security and a lot of words about it here's what Democrats have been saying about it.
It's absurd that Elon Musk is trying to eliminate billions of dollars from Social Security.
Elon Musk and President Trump have set their sights on cutting Social Security.
Their goal is clear: destroy Social Security from within.
Now, when you listen to that, it sounds pretty bad. In fact, if you rely on Social Security, you're probably a little bit terrified. But here's the question. What has Doge really done with respect to programs like Social Security? And you can find answers to that in this clip right here.
At Social Security, one of the first things we learned is that they get phone calls every day of people trying to change direct deposit information. So when you want to change your bank account, you can call Social Security. We learned 40% of the phone calls that they get are from fraudsters.
40%?
That's right. Almost half.
You heard that right. 40% of the calls Social Security receives for the purpose of changing direct deposit numbers are from people trying to commit fraud. So let me ask you something. Are you glad that Doge caught that? Because regardless of how you feel about the overall running and management of Social Security, and I've got a lot of critiques, can we at least get some bipartisan support for the idea that we should be doing everything we can to create a better process whereby grandma's check doesn't get stolen? Or is that too partisan for some people? But look, it's not just the fraud, which, by the way, fraud alone can account for up to $100 million in lost revenue per year through Social Security. But do you want to take a crack at how much is lost just through improper payments? Well, a 2024 Office of the Inspector General report estimated that from 2015 to 2022, Social Security made $71.8 billion in improper payments, averaging around $10.3 billion annually. So why would anyone be mad at the fact that Doge is trying to modernize, update, and improve processes to make the experience better and thwart both improper payments and deliberate fraud? And it's not just Social Security where things like this are happening. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services tracks improper payments for Medicaid through the Payment Error Rate Measurement Program. In fiscal year 2024, the Medicaid improper payment rate was 5.09%, which doesn't sound too bad until you realize that that translates to about $31.1 billion in federal improper payments. How about Medicare? For fiscal year 2024, Medicare's improper payment rate was 6.53%, amounting to $31.9 billion in federal improper payments. Now, when you add all of that up between Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare, that's a grand total of approximately $70 billion in lost funds annually. That means every year. But yeah, your main concern should be the fact that Doge is investigating it and has access to data in order to be able to conduct that investigation. If this hasn't already made you mad, just for fun, let's open it up to the rest of the government. How much revenue, how much money, how much of your tax dollars do you think is essentially lost every year due to fraud, waste, abuse, and errors? Well, we asked AI, and here are the results. So the moderate estimate, the moderate one, says that Elon and Doge could probably get to $1 trillion just on fraud, waste, abuse, and errors alone. That's before they even have to cut anything from the budget. So when they attack Doge, remember this quote from Elon that he delivered in this interview.
Usually when they attack Doge, they never attack any of the specifics. So they'll say what we're doing is somehow unconstitutional or illegal or whatever. We're like, well, which line of the cost savings do you disagree with? And they can't point to any. And we list them all on doge.gov.
That's a great question. And to all of the politicians out there that seem to have a big problem with Doge, instead of giving us predictions of doom and gloom, instead of suggesting that every federal dollar or every federal job lost was critical when the evidence suggests otherwise, instead of trying to scare and terrify people on Medicaid, Medicare, or Social Security, how about you tell us specifically this time which spending Doge has identified that you think the American taxpayer should be on the hook for? Not what spending you might like, not what spending or programs you might think are important, especially when it comes to some of this foreign spending. I want you to specifically tell us. I want you to look taxpayers in the eye and say, you know what? You should be spending this. You should be financing this through your tax dollars. We think it's a great idea. And if you don't like it, well, then you're a bad person. Go ahead and say that. We'll wait.